Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for April 16th, 2021. As we're in the midst of an extremely dangerous strategic situation, and a situation that's very challenging also, I'm going to begin with some updates before I take a few questions, because it's important that people from a day-to-day basis know what the big picture is. Now, what we've been looking at the last couple of days is the effects of the escalation of sanctions policies as a form of hybrid warfare against Russia, China, and other purported enemies of the United States and Western Europe. Helge Zepp-LaRouche, the chairman of the Schiller Institute, issued a call for the immediate lifting of the Caesar sanctions against Syria, as these are sanctions which are faked to be humanitarian concerns, that is, to protect the Syrian people from the so-called dictator Assad. But in reality, what they're doing is killing people. They're plunging 90% of the Syrian population below the poverty level. And the papal nuncio, Cardinal Zinari, has issued a call immediately for people of the world to act to defend the people of Syria, not by creating more misery, as the Caesar sanctions passed by the United States are doing, but to lift them and actually begin a process of economic reconstruction. What the Schiller Institute has proposed is, most importantly, that the Belt and Road Initiative of China be immediately extended into Southwest Asia to include the process of rebuilding the war-torn nations that are torn up by war that was initiated by the war hawks in the United States. I've written an article that will appear on my blog page in the next days on what are the Caesar sanctions and what they portend. So you can look for that, but also go to our schillerinstitute.com website to download Helge Zepp-LaRouche's call and circulate that. Now, with the Ukraine situation, there are really mixed signals. There's some people saying, well, there's a pullback from it. The United States did not send 2 destroyers into the Black Sea. President Biden did call President Putin to suggest a summit within the next couple of months. However, at the same time, the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany issued a blackmail threat. He said, either we're a part of NATO or we have one option. We may start thinking about nuclear weapons. Now, this is an outrageous provocation from Ukraine. The idea of nuclear weapons on the borders of Russia takes the whole attack on the Red Line one step further. But there's a lot of talk in NATO which is completely jingoistic and threatening to the Russians. And at the same time, the U.S. announced yesterday new sanctions against Russia that would include sanctions against anyone purchasing Russian-denominated debt, ruble-denominated debt. This would completely hammer the Russian economy. This is a warlike threat, and the president justified it by saying that, well, Russia hacked the SolarWinds company and also engaged in election fraud against the 2020 election, with the usual suspects, the anonymous sources in the intelligence community, confirming that these events happened, but presenting absolutely zero evidence, just like Russiagate. So these kinds of threats do not look good for the prospects for a Putin-Biden summit. And Putin himself said that it may be, if the U.S. continues this way, there will not be a summit. Now, also you have Sullivan saying that the whole purpose of the summit is to prevent relations from worsening. Well, what makes them worse? The calls for arming Ukraine, bringing Ukraine into NATO, nuclear weapons for Ukraine, devastating economic sanctions against Russia. Just calling for a summit doesn't mitigate those threats. So we'll see what happens on that front. Now, also, we have an interesting development. We've been reporting on the difficulties the U.S. is having with the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. When John Kerry went to India, he was basically kicked in the gut when the Indians basically said, well, okay, you want to do this, go ahead, we support the effort, but we're not going to deny development to the people of our nation or to the people of Africa. Well, the Chinese just announced they will participate in a summit, I believe, on April 16th with Germany and France on the green policy, on the climate policy, but they have not confirmed yet that they will join the Earth Day summit of Biden. The Russians have not indicated they would. And so we see the potential for a broad opposition against this crazy policy based on fake science. So we have to mobilize against these kinds of sanctions and war moves, and at the same time, for the LaRouche program, a positive program of economic development, instead of sanctions and instead of the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. Now, there are a couple of questions I can take up that are related to these crises. One was a question someone asked, why is there silence in the Western press on how dangerous the situation regarding Ukraine is? Well, the only thing you're getting in the U.S. press is that Russia's mobilizing forces, Russia annexed Crimea, Russia is arming the people of the eastern Ukraine against the Ukrainian government. It's Russia, Russia, Russia. Do they ever report on the fact that the Ukrainian defense forces are infiltrated by members of a neo-Nazi militia who were involved in the February 2014 coup? Do they ever report the role that Joe Biden played in the coup in February 2014? They report on the laptop of Hunter Biden, which shows that there may have been a significant pay for the Biden family from Hunter Biden's involvement with Burisma. But when it comes to the actual role Biden played with the regime changers, there's where the silence is, and that should give you a clue. The point of the whole mobilization is to convince the American people that Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, that these are enemies bent on the destruction of the United States without any evidence, and that therefore we need a military buildup and an alliance that will surround them and isolate them for the purposes of what? A unipolar world order in defense of the City of London banks and Wall Street. So that's why they don't report these things. They just report what they want you to hear. And you shouldn't be shocked by this. Not only does the mainstream media print lies all the time, but if you try to get the truth out, you might be subject to censorship from the social media. So that's plain and simple what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a situation in which there's an agenda to establish a unipolar world order completely dominated by the US, the British, and possibly Western Europe as allies, and to suppress any positive news that's coming out about a possible alternative, including the possible alternative of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is described as a Chinese imperial policy. The next question that comes out is, how do you maintain a sense of pride in our country when our leaders continue to make irresponsible decisions that draw us toward new wars? Well, the pride in the country is not based on who's sitting in the White House or who's controlling the Congress. It's the philosophical tradition and the related economic policies that have made the United States a power in the world. We're not a power in the world because we win wars. We've won some wars because we had the right economic policy, especially World War I and World War II, that allowed for not only the development of the United States, but was committed to the development of other nations, as we see especially from Franklin Roosevelt's intentions at the end of World War II to reconstruct the nations that were damaged in the war, but also to decolonize the world that was under the effects of European colonization. So the pride is in the tradition, the philosophical, scientific tradition of the American system, which has been applied by other countries successfully. Now, how do you deal with that? Well, the next question that was asked is, how can citizens affect presidential policy while the war party occupies the White House? Well, for most of the period since 1971, the war party has been dominant, as has been the neoliberal party. That's why we go into these bubble economies and then collapses. So the question of what you do take the example of Lyndon LaRouche to heart. LaRouche ran for president, I think, 8 times from 1976 on. Each time, his campaigns were slandered viciously by the media, ignored for the most part. When we won delegates, the Democratic Party wouldn't seat them. When our candidates won, they were slandered as neo-Nazis, racists, communists, and so on. But that didn't stop LaRouche. LaRouche continued to press forward based on his confidence in both his ability to come up with new creative solutions, but also his understanding of history and the necessity for leadership that speaks the truth, even if no one's listening. Now, this is crucial, and it gets to the question of where do you find pride in your country? Up to this point, we have a history of an ongoing war between the American Constitutional Republic and the policies of the British Empire. That war at times has been won by the Americans. At other times, like today, the United States is operating on a leash held by the City of London and Wall Street. That doesn't change the nature of what our country represents or who we are. So whether you're a minority of one or you're beginning to see a growth in our movement, the point is, speak out boldly, seek the truth, and figure out ways to creatively induce other people to do the same. The American system functions, or a republic functions, when citizens are activated around principle, not for personal benefit, but for the general welfare. It's in our Constitution. So that's where you draw your strength. And I think if you look at the campaigns Lyndon LaRouche ran, if you look at what Helga Zepp LaRouche is doing, putting herself in front right now in the fight against the global pandemic, against the deliberate genocide being committed against the people of Syria, against the people of Yemen, against people of a number of African countries that face starvation. It may not be popular to speak out about these things, but it's right. And what we have to do is show that, for example, the people supporting the sanctions against Syria in the name of humanitarian efforts, that it's not humanitarian to kill children. They're not protecting the people of Syria by starving them and keeping medicine from going into the country. And this hypocrisy, this ugly, evil face of hypocrisy, which comes out in sanctions, and some people have said correctly, sanctions are more brutal than warfare because you can't fight back physically. Well, we're going to fight back by exposing the fraud, exposing the evil, and putting forward an alternative policy. So join us at the Schiller Institute to do that, and the LaRouche Organization. Become a spokesman for truth and the beauty of the American system. And that's how you can have pride. So thank you for joining me today. I'll be back with you next Monday.